One day, in an unexpected manner, Dan learned the enemy had made plans to land men on our Atlantic coast by submarine. Going down the main street of his city one afternoon, Dan was stopped by a man who staggered out of a tavern and bumped against him. Grabbing him, Dan steadied him and said to him, "My friend, if you will let Jesus Christ save you, you wouldn't want to get into this condition again." Sobering rapidly, the poor man asked, "Are you a preacher?" "Why, yes I am," Dan replied. "God saved me from the drink habit, and he can save you." The man, now sobering fast, said, "Preacher, let's go somewhere and talk. I've got something I've got to tell somebody." "Sure," said Dan, and thinking that the man wanted to talk about his soul, led him to the back room of the chapel. Once settled there, he inquired, "Now, what's on your mind?" "Preacher," said the stranger, "I came out of the joint down there as mad as a wet hen. I was so mad I couldn't see straight. I had just heard something that made me fighting mad. I may be a drunk, but I'm an American. And when I hear fellas talking about how they're going to land men in this country and tear up our plants and try to wreck our war plans, it makes me mad." Dan's pulse rate took a sudden jump and his interest went sky high. Was this story real, or was it just the imagination of a drunken mind? Dan thought he must go along with being just a preacher and calmly said, "Sit down and tell me about it." During the next 30 minutes, Dan listened to a story that put him back into business as an undercover agent. According to the man, the tavern had 2 rooms in it, separated by a very thin wall. The man had been on one side of this wall in a booth, and being partly drunk and partly very sleepy, had leaned his head against the partition with his ear flat against the wall. "I thought I was dreaming, preacher, but what I heard woke me up. These guys on the other side were talking real low, and they had foreign accents, but I wasn't mistaken. They were talking about how submarines are to land men on our coast so they can try to mess up our war effort." Dan could hardly contain himself, but managed to mutter, "That's too bad. Maybe I can tell someone that can do something about it." Dan's thoughts were in a turmoil until he was jolted by another statement of his informant. "They're coming back tomorrow and meet some more fellows in the same booth." Dan lost his composure and almost yelled, "What? How do you know that?" "I heard them playing it all," the fellow said, "and it made me so fighting mad I had to get out of there." "My friend," Dan said, turning to the man, "can you keep this a secret if I promise to see if something can be done? And could you show me the very booth in which those men were sitting?" "Reverend, I'll do anything you tell me to do. By the way, I've got to go back down there anyway. I left my coat and I didn't even pay for my last drink. Yep, I gotta go back." "Wait a minute," said Dan. "You say you didn't pay for your last drink and you left your coat in the booth opposite where those men were sitting?" "That's right, Reverend, and I've got to go pay my bill and get my coat. Mister, will you let me go with you and do all of the talking?" "Whatever you say, Reverend." Dan handed the man some money and, picking up his Bible and some gospel tracts, led the way down the street toward the tavern. A plan was already forming in his mind. He knew the section of town well, and knew the tavern was located in a cheap hotel building. That would make it easy to carry out the plan that was already forming in his mind. "Well, Reverend, what brings you into my place of business?" And the big bartender reached a hand across the bar to shake hands. With a laugh, Dan said, "Bill, our friend here left a while ago and didn't pay his bill. He wants to go straighten that out. He also left his coat and wants to go get it. By the way, Bill, while he's doing that, do you mind if I give the fellow some gospel tracts?" The bartender laughed uneasily as he replied, "Reverend, every time you bring someone back in here to pay their bill, you can give out all the tracts you want to." Turning towards the booth and looking through the dim lights, Dan almost lost his composure. He caught only a fleeting glimpse of a face in one of the rear booths that he had seen with some other agents he had tailed. The would-be drunk paid his bill and, stepping up to Dan's side, said, "My coat is over there on the other side, Reverend." As Dan slowly turned to follow the man, he quickly counted the booths to where he now knew the enemy agents were sitting. He knew it was exactly opposite the one in which he had seen the familiar face of the enemy. The man went on his way, promising to never tell anyone what he had heard. Back in the security of his office, Dan lost no time. He must act quickly. 21 Plus needs to see 35 as soon as possible, and the expected click on the other end told him that his phone contact was working. A call to the hotel in which the tavern was located brought hopeful news that he could reserve a front room right over the street. What the clerk didn't know was that the room he had just reserved for a Philip Boise was to an assumed name. He innocently jotted down the arrival time as 11 p.m. Carl, he spoke familiarly, I need a little help on my amplification tonight. Do you still have the real small amplifier? Good. Can I rent it for a few days? Also, I want to buy one of those little bitty mics and 200 feet of the smallest microphone cable that you have. Okay, I'll be there in a few minutes. 35 made no effort to hide his astonishment that night in the back room of the chapel when Dan related the events of the day. Within a few minutes, the plans had been laid. Be careful, 21 Plus. It looks as though this thing will soon be over, and we surely don't want you to be a casualty. Dan presented himself at 11 o'clock at the hotel desk. Mr. Philip Boise, your room is ready for you, said the clerk as he handed him his registration card. Could I make a slight change in plans? Asked Dan. A friend of mine is to be in town tonight, and I'd like for him to share my room. His name is Ben Southern, and we will be here 2 days. I'll pay you now. The clerk agreed, took the money, and then carried Dan's bags up the stairs, little knowing they contained nothing but electronic equipment. 35 arrived 30 minutes later. The men worked fast. 35 had brought a small hand drill with an extension bit, and it didn't take long to put a very small hole through the floor in the corner of the clothes closet, where it was never discovered, by the way, and the ceiling. The wire Dan had secured was hardly noticeable, and long before daylight, the microphone was in place beneath the table. The amplifier was connected in the hotel room, and 35's recorder was ready to get the entire day's conversation from the booth downstairs. 35 introduced him to another in disguise that looked exactly like himself. When he recovered from his surprise, Dan laughed. A sense of relief swept over him as he realized 35 had planned for his safety. I'll let you know what happens here, said 35, and 21 Plus, keep your eyes open. We've located the agent that you recognized. He's staying at this hotel. He's working for 2 governments, getting secrets from each and selling them to the other. He's extremely dangerous, so be careful. Dan was glad to slip home before dawn and was extremely anxious to know if his electronic work had served its purpose. He was not to know until the next day when he stood beside the casket of a funeral he was officiating. As a man approached the casket, he said, "He must have suffered a lot." Dan could hardly contain himself at the familiar voice of 35. In a low voice, 35 said, "It couldn't have been any better. We got complete plans for their submarine plot, plus a lot of other things. We got the names and locations of some folk we have been looking for. Keep your radio on and watch the papers. You'll learn the end in a few days." With a pat on the shoulder and a shake of the hand, 35 walked out. Dan noticed that he stopped to sign the guest register, but knew instinctively that he did not give his right name. Dan listened to the news and watched the papers. 2 weeks passed. Then it came. Enemy agents landed on our Atlantic coast, were caught immediately, the subs tracked and sunk. There was also a large roundup of enemy agents. It was never told that the case was cracked by a drunkard and a preacher.